Cities must keep improving, or else they'll decay. Part of this means replacing old rundown buildings with new ones. But when we talk about city or neighborhood improvement, the topic of gentrification always comes up. And the problem of pushing out local populations in favor of higher income residents is always an issue. Is gentrification really bad? And what does this have to do with Jane Jacobs' third condition for a diverse city? We've looked at Jane Jacobs' first two conditions for a diverse city, and so this brings us to her third condition, the need for aged buildings. Her third condition is as follows. The district must mingle buildings that vary in age and condition, including a good proportion of old ones. She argues that cities need a mixture of plain, low-value old buildings and some run-down buildings. The mixture of ages allows for different enterprises and people of different income levels to reside in the same area. Basically, new buildings are expensive. New buildings can refer to new construction, or it can refer to old buildings that have been renovated and maintained. Nevertheless, whether it's new construction or the renovation of an existing building, these have high capital costs. Developers need to pay for it by charging higher rent, and the people or businesses renting the spaces must have high incomes and profits. If a large high-rise is constructed, it's likely to be owned by an outside owner and developer. As a result, those commercial tenants that can afford such costs are usually chain stores, chain restaurants, and banks, and most costs leave the local economy. On the other hand, older buildings should have depreciated to the point where they require less income. This means that these older buildings are more suitable to mom-and-pop shops and people of various incomes. Furthermore, smaller, older buildings are more likely to be owned by a local landlord where profits will stay within the local economy. This process is known as filtering, where housing units change price over time and get passed to different income groups. Jacobs argues that if incubation is successful, the yield of buildings rises, bringing up the older buildings with them. She says many of cities' enterprises, which have become important economic assets, start small and poor and become able eventually to afford carrying costs of rehabilitation or new construction. But this process cannot occur without the low-yield space in the right place in which to start. She argues that cities shouldn't have large swatches of construction built at one time. In places where buildings were all built at the same time, they age at the same rate. If a new building happens to pop up, it's considered a major change that people resist. In fact, the problem is that the neighborhood has changed too little over time because a good city should work like this. It should be cyclical. Old buildings will be gradually replaced with new or renovated ones that have higher rents, and these buildings will have lower rents. We can look at major cities around the world and see that this is a bit of an oversimplification because simply having a mixture of aged buildings in the city doesn't do enough to keep neighborhoods affordable these days. Why is that? Well, it's true that buildings left alone over time, assuming no renovations, will become less valuable. She says, time makes the high building costs of one generation the bargains of the following generation. And buildings typically do depreciate just like other physical assets. But we also need to consider the value of land. In other words, at any point in time, the building has a certain value and so does the land it sits on. As cities grow and improve, the demand to live and operate businesses in the city grows, and naturally the price of land increases. Jacobs uses the example of Greenwich Village, where the houses are old, yet the value is only going up. She calls this process filtering up, and it occurs when gentrification exceeds filtering. Perhaps this was more an anomaly when she was writing the book, but today filtering up is happening in a lot of cities. In fact, it seems that land in cities only gets more expensive compared to the average in the area, while suburban land remains constant or even decreases compared to the average. An excess of gentrification can cause property taxes to rise and lead to higher income residents replacing lower income residents who are forced to move elsewhere. In a lot of cities, filtering up is a problem that's caused by poor planning policies and zoning restrictions. Essentially, if there's a housing shortage, basic economics tells us that if demand increases but we want to keep the price the same, then supply has to increase as well. Cities can increase the supply by expanding up or out. Single-family homes might get replaced by low-rise buildings and eventually by high-rises. Cities that build more housing see less filtering up. Unfortunately, in America, we don't have a good cyclical process of replacing aging buildings. In the case of suburbs, housing developments are all built at the same time. Other zoning rules prevent cities from expanding by limiting commercial and mixed uses in certain areas. Places like islands have an obvious limited supply of land dictated by physical boundaries. But other cities in America have the room to expand but are artificially limiting the supply through policies. Just to be clear, neighborhoods need new and improved buildings. We can't avoid gentrification altogether, though this is what some people fight for. As I said in the very beginning of this video, cities that don't improve will decay. What happens when filtering far exceeds gentrification is that affluent families move out of the neighborhood altogether, and this is definitely not something good either. According to this paper, a gradual pace of redevelopment resulting in historical diversity of housing significantly predicts social relations, lending support to Jacobs' claims, though not to the point that we can say mixed ages cause better cities. This is to be expected because, like Jacobs' other two conditions, mixed ages are necessary for diverse cities, but just because a city has a mixture of aged buildings doesn't mean it's functioning optimally. So in summary, cities should be careful to keep a mixture of buildings of different ages and not to redevelop in large chunks. Cities need a mingling of old buildings to cultivate primary diversity mixtures as well as secondary diversity. This ensures gradual progress that's not overly shocking culturally or economically. Cities in high demand need the ability to intensify and expand, else they face the problem of filtering up, where even aged buildings don't do enough to keep neighborhoods affordable for local residents. Unfortunately, this is easier said than done due to land constraints, and more commonly due to policy and zoning constraints placed upon single-aged suburbs. Gentrification itself shouldn't be the enemy. Rather, we should try to keep gentrification and filtering fairly balanced. This also begs the question, if you were building an entire city or town from scratch, how do you address this? Feel free to leave your comments, thoughts, agreements, and disagreements below.